Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. In the past few days, it's great to see the slightly longer evenings. I can hear the birds starting to sing and a little bit more colour coming into cereal fields. Farmers have been gearing up to start land work, with some farmers on lighter land already beginning to plough their land. There are a few growers with winter seed in store and they will be anxious to plant this seed, but time is certainly running out for this operation. Beans are probably the next crop that farmers are going to consider planting. Beans benefit from early planting both in terms of yield and early harvesting. This is the first of 4 podcasts looking at protein crops and the potential they hold for Ireland. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Ciaran Collins, a Tillage Specialist in Teagasc, to discuss planting beans in the coming weeks and how to get the best from this crop in 2023. So Ciaran, you might give us an idea about the area planted in 2022 and also the yields in 2022 and how they compared to the long-term average.
Yeah, last year we had 9,200 hectares of spring beans. Now there was also some winter beans as well. And I suppose if you look backwards since the introduction of the protein payment in 2015, the long-term average of spring beans has been around 9,500 hectares. So last year was very close to that average. In terms of yield, Michael, it was an excellent year for beans overall. However, there's always ups and downs and slightly more variable yields than other crops, but 6.1 tons per hectare last year was the average yield. So that's 2.44 tons in per acre. And again, if you look at the long-term average since 15 is 5.4. So, last year was above average, which was a good signal really.
So Ciaran, in terms of those yields last year, any idea why those yields were as good as they were, or did it just follow the trends maybe of some of the cereal yields, which were also really good?
Yeah, I think that's the first point. Overall yields in general were good. I suppose a favourable year really. I suppose one of the key things with beans is that they don't suffer stress, particularly around flowering time, and that stress can be environmental, it can be a late frost, it can be, bad weather, cold, too hot. It can also be caused by disease, say a lot of chocolate spot around that time can cause flowers to drop off. So I think we didn't have those things last year, and I think that was a contributory factor anyway.
Although people would also, often associate beans and drought or being in dry ground and drought coming along the line. We had a lot of dry weather last year. It just, did it come at just a slightly the wrong time or the right time, I suppose, maybe for beans?
Yeah, I think the crucial period is in around flowering. So if you get that drought maybe in May or even early June, it can have an impact. When that dry weather comes later, it doesn't appear to have the same impact on yield. So I think last year, and there's certainly, some of the lower yields, I think we could have identified drought as being part of the issue there. But certainly where the better yields were, I think, drought wasn't an issue last year, I would say.
Okay. So Ciaran, there's good yields, there's reasonable amount of area there, there's reasonably good yields there. The government in the background have quite a big ambition to increase that area over the longer term. You might just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I suppose if we look at, say, farm to fork, the ambition there is to have more native sustainable protein in the EU. So the government obviously have adopted that. We have seen documents like Ag Climatise, which actually targets 40,000 hectares of beans in Ireland. The new CAP, which will run for the next 7 years, up to 27, has a fund now of 7 million, and that's an increase from 3 million in the previous regime. So what you're looking at there is dividing the area into that fund. So the ambition there is to support 20,000 hectares of legumes. So that could be peas, beans, soy or lupins, but ultimately beans will be the majority of that, certainly in the short term. So, if we can get up to 20,000 hectares, that's a protein payment of €350 a hectare. However, in the interim, while that area is progressing up, if you take this year, that payment could be much higher. That payment could be €400, even €500 a hectare, depending on the area sown. So the area last year was 9.2 of spring beans, but if the total area of legumes there went up to, say, 14,000 hectares, that would be €500 a hectare. If we went up to, say, 17,000 hectares, that would work out, I think, about €400 a hectare. So that's kind of the variability that's within that payment.
And Ciaran, with that, is there a maximum payment that the government are going to pay out on that?
Yeah, it's 583 would be the maximum payment, but I suppose the signals are that would be unlikely, I suppose, unless the weather deteriorated and crops weren't sown, you know.
Okay. So in terms of the finances then, how does that work then into, I suppose, the overall gross margin? Is all that needed to support a gross margin for it to be similar to a decent crop of cereals, or is it better than that?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it comes down to the protein payment, but I suppose basing our figures on a protein payment of €500 a hectare for 2023, our cost and returns figures this year would show that the margin from beans would actually be twice that of spring barley based on average yields for both crops. So financially, beans really stack up for the year ahead.
Okay, geez, well, that's it. That everyone should be listening now at this stage. I think that's a serious amount of money, but that's all well and fine saying that's what the potential you can actually make. But in terms of local markets, you have to be able to sell the stuff at the end of the day. What sort of local markets are out there? Is everyone looking for beans, or is it a bit mixed?
It's a bit mixed, yeah. It really depends on the area that you're in, and whether, as you rightly say, there's no point growing a crop if there's nobody in the local area to purchase it. So I suppose if anybody's considering beans, the financials obviously stack up. But you need to make sure that you have a commitment from somebody to purchase them at harvest. And it does really depend on the area. But I think we've seen it from the seminars going around this year. There is more interest from the local trade and merchants in supporting beans this year, I think.
Okay, and of course the other side of it then is a potential for mixed farmers to potentially feed it to their own stock. Is that a reasonable prospect, or is beans harder to work with maybe than some of the existing grain they might have on their farms?
Yeah, they can certainly be fed to your own stock. I'm no expert on the nutritional side of the house, but I know that beans, they are an excellent source of protein and energy. And in fact, the energy is as good as what you're getting in cereals. And I'm told that the protein is very easily degradable in the rumen. So beans in a diet certainly stack up from the ruminant perspective. To feed them, really, they need to be rolled, or sometimes they grind them as well. So if you have a facility to roll them, certainly that is an option on farm.
Getting into the practicalities then, so if a farmer has decided that beans is for the farmer in a particular year, is there, or what considerations should a farmer take into consideration in terms of field selection first and foremost?
Yeah, I suppose if I was a first-time grower growing beans, I would choose a very high fertility field. I think that ultimately is crucial. You can substitute obviously with P's and K's, phosphorus and potassium, but any of the trials that we've done would show that beans almost respond a little bit better than cereals to a high fertility site, so I certainly would go there. The other thing that's vital and can sometimes get lost because we try to sow beans early in the season is pH. Make sure that pH is 6.5 or higher. Get lime out if that's required, but that's a crucial factor as well that we've seen in people that get good yield beans.
Okay, and the phosphorus end of it from trials, that's also a very significant thing to have relatively high in the ground.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, a high fertility, if it's index 4, obviously you don't have to apply any, but certainly target an index 3. But what we've seen from the trials, where you were, say, an index 1, and you have obviously a phosphorus allowance that you can apply there in the form of, say, 0.1020 or 0.730. You still, with the chemical application on an index 1, you won't make up the difference that you would have got, say, from an index 3 or even an index 4 site.
And of course, Ciaran, the difficulty there is not quite the same as cereals. You're trying to plant these beans quite deep, so trying to get that fertilizer down beside a bean that's way down there is particularly difficult.
Yeah. No, as I say, like I would go for, especially for a first time grower, somebody new to beans, is try and, if it's suitable, try and pick a field that's got really good fertility.
Okay, great. So from that point of view, then when should people start planting beans?
This is a bit of an open question. Leona Murphy, who did some work in Teagasc on this over 3 seasons, found similar yields actually from February, March, and April planting. However, I think there is an advantage in getting them sown earlier, especially on lighter or drier soils. Now, you would target a heavier bodied soil, and going back to where we started a while ago in terms of, that drought stress, you might be able to alleviate a bit of that on a heavier soil. So that would be the first thing. But I think there might be a slight advantage in being a little bit earlier, certainly on lighter soils. I suppose, put another way, I wouldn't let the opportunity of fine weather pass from now until, say, mid-March without getting them in. I don't think there's any advantage in delaying and waiting, really. So I think, Michael, in summary, there's a wide window there, but I think if the opportunity comes sooner rather than later, I think would be the advice.
Ciaran, just in terms of, is there any different recommendation in terms of the lighter or the heavier soils in terms of a seeding rate? Or do we kind of pick in around the similar kind of seeding rate? And I suppose before we start, what is the right seeding rate?
Yeah, so like if you're planting in the autumn, you're talking about a much lower seeding rate than, say, later in the spring. And I go back to Leona Murphy's paper there that was done in Oak Park in 16 to 19. I think the range was as broad as 13 to 38 seeds with an average of about 25. But I think for the earlier part of the spring, you're on the lower end of that, maybe to get to about 25 plants per square meter. And then as you go later into the spring, maybe heading in towards March, maybe increasing that to 30 and 35. In terms of seeding rate as well, it's vital to look at the 1,000 grain weight, because that can have a massive influence on bean seeding rate. So like if you're looking at, say, a 1,000 grain rate of 500, you might be looking at, say, 175, 180 kilos per hectare. But if you get up to 600, that'll increase that to over 200 kgs per hectare. So it's important to do that calculation before you sow.
Okay, so it can be a relatively high seeding rate. In terms of varieties, Ciaran, what sort of varieties are out there, or is there much of a choice in terms of maybe a different site, what people or what way people should go in terms of those varieties?
Yeah, I suppose there's two main varieties really available, and working off the department recommended list, Lynx would be the highest yielding variety. It's approximately 72% of the seed that's available this year. So that will obviously be the biggest variety out there by some way. There's also a variety called Caprice. I think it's about 28% of the seed that's available. Wouldn't be as high yielding in the department trials. However, it does have higher protein, so that's just something to keep in mind, especially maybe if you're keeping them for your own use. There's also another variety on the recommended list called Victus. I think there might be a very, very limited amount of seed available, and I suppose maybe a trend of what we're looking to going for future markets, it's low in some anti-nutritional compounds, like visine, convisine. So that would probably be targeted maybe at higher value markets.
I suppose in terms of farmers getting the crop into the ground, the next one then really is around pest control. Farmers would talk about pigeon, well, I suppose crows more so than pigeons, but certainly pests can be a little bit of a problem. Is there any actions farmers can take to try and minimize those risks?
Yeah, crows are going to be number one, and especially if you're sowing beans in the early part of the spring. They'll dig down until they'll find the seed. So I think for people sowing early, try and get them down as deep as possible. So some of the direct drills, then they really suit direct drilling this time of year. If you can get the ground dry enough to work those drills, you can get down maybe 4 or 5 inches, and that keeps them away from the crows. Now, ultimately, when the beans will come up, they'll then start pulling at the stalks to try and find the seed. But I think getting them down deep is certainly an option. Is the best way to keep crows away from them. Also, also some people are actually still ploughing in beans, and that's proven to be quite successful as well. So getting them down deep anyway is probably the initial thing of getting them away from crows. And I suppose once we get into the season, really, I suppose bean weevil is always something that you're watching out for as well. They produce these U-shaped notches on the leaves, but it's the larvae actually that do the damage to the root nodules. So that's something maybe for later on in the season.
In terms of planting them deep, can you plant them too deep? Certainly people would be worried about cereals planting it too deep, but for beans, can you go too deep?
No, I don't think, well, within reason, obviously. People have ploughed them down to 5 and 6 inches, maybe even a little bit more without any complications. Obviously, they're going to take a little bit longer to come up, which maybe is no bad thing when you're sowing them at this time of year.
Okay, and finally then weed control, because the amount of products available are kind of narrow. What's the best way of going about trying to control weeds in beans?
Yeah, it's a great question, Michael, because you've only have one opportunity, and that's pre-emerge really. So most of the herbicides are pendimethalin based, so you're talking about the likes of Nirvana really would be a quite common one. Stallion there with clomazone and Defy would also be an option as well. But I think the key message here is pre-emergence. Get it on, almost when you get your seed, you're nearly as well off to get the herbicide as well, so that you're ready to go. There is a post-emergent option in Bazagran. It's a tricky enough product to use, and it's got a limited enough weed spectrum. So it's pre-emergence for the broadleaf weeds really. Now you can do grass weeds, and beans are absolutely fabulous to tidy up grass weeds on a farm, and that can be done post-emergence there later in the spring, all right. But I think for broadleaf weeds, pre-emerge is the message there.
So for pre-emerge herbicides, should a farmer be considering or trying to roll that ground, or is it even possible maybe this time of the year? Is it necessary maybe from the point of view of pre-emerges? And I suppose just the last question, does the pre-emerge need to go on almost directly after sowing, or is there a little bit of time between planting and when it comes up?
There is a little bit of scope. Yeah, there is a little bit of scope, but I think I would plan to do it as soon as possible, because, if the conditions have been good enough to sow it, you'd kind of hope that it's good enough to do the herbicide as well. The danger with waiting is that the beans start to come near the surface, the weather is bad, and you haven't had the opportunity, and you miss the boat. So I think, get it on really as soon as you could, soon as you can. I think in terms of seedbed is important, Michael. Certainly for all pre-emerges, you want to avoid cloddy soil. So if you can get a fine tilt, that will help the activity of the pre-emerge herbicide. All right.
Brilliant. That's great, Ciaran. Thanks very much. It's a brilliant update. Hopefully it'll give people a really good indication about how to go about it and where to go about it, I suppose, more importantly. Ciaran, thanks very much for your time. And look, we'll be chatting to you again in a few weeks.
No bother. Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Ciaran for joining me on the show. Look out for the next episodes around the protein series over the next few weeks. Also, keep an eye out for the spring cereal seminars in your area over the next number of weeks. You'll see more details for this at www.teagasc.ie. Finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, and recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.